Back in the late 1980s, early 1990s, scientists constructed a research facility in Aupperle, Arizona. It was called the Biosphere 2. In short, it's a miniature version of our planet, and its purpose was to study how the Earth's living systems work. And so the biosphere was outfitted with a variety of representative biomes. In other words, rainforests, wetlands, deserts were all created in a controlled, optimum environment. Everything was provided for the success of these biomes, and consequently, in many ways, the biosphere flourished. After all, potential threats and challenges had all been removed. The result was tranquility and beauty among the various life forms. But one of the major discoveries was something that the scientists never expected. Researchers found that the trees they planted grew faster than they would in the wild, but they also learned that the trees weren't completely mature. In fact, they fell over before they were of reproductive age. Scientists were puzzled. Why were the biosphere trees such pushovers? The answer was eventually discovered. No wind. Though scientists had prepped Biosphere 2 to reflect nature, wind was one part of nature that they didn't or couldn't account for. One commentator stated it like this. He said, "The lack of wind created trees with much softer wood than that species would normally make in the wild. They grew more quickly than they did in the wild, but were harmed in the long run as a consequence." And right about now, you're probably thinking, Gary, where in the world are you going with all this? Well, stop and think about it. Just as the wind is essential for creating strong trees, so adversity and resistance are necessary for building strong disciples. And you know what? I'm guessing Nehemiah would have agreed. If you haven't already done so, go ahead and grab your copy of the scriptures and dial up Nehemiah chapter 4. That's where we're going to drop anchor this morning. We try to make the outlines available as you're entering the building. There's some on the back table. If we missed you, I have a lovely assistant up front here, and if you just raise your hand, she would be glad to supply you with one of those outlines. Lovely assistant, maybe you should stand up so you can see if people are raising their hands. Okay. Anybody need one? We're good. That's great. Yeah, you can follow along and track with me on that outline, fill in some of those blanks. You'll see the direction that we're going here very quickly. We're over halfway home in our study of this book. The message today is the remedy for rubble out of Nehemiah chapter 4, but the series itself, of course, has been entitled The Story of a New Beginning. And I hope by now you're picking up on the fact that Nehemiah's story is essentially our story, isn't it? This godly leader was experiencing a new chapter in life. It was a fresh start for him, just as this venture called a City of a Hill Church is a new beginning for us. And what kind of essentials are necessary for this new beginning? Well, let me just give you a short synopsis of what we've learned thus far. When Nehemiah heard the report back in chapter 1 that the wall was broken down in Jerusalem, God gave him a vision, didn't he? He sensed a nudge of God upon his heart of what could be accomplished through an obedient servant. And so Nehemiah went to prayer. And you'll recall that he prayed for 4 months, day and night, according to the scriptures, about the right timing and just seeking God's direction in this matter. Finally, the time came for our hero to take a risk by making his desires known to his employer, King Artaxerxes. He sacrificed his own personal safety to see the project move forward, didn't he? And then last week, Nehemiah demonstrated that critical essential of cooperation. He assigned everyone a place on the wall. The mission must be a team effort with everybody pulling their weight and everybody doing their part if the vision was to be accomplished. Today we'll discover that nothing of lasting significance transpires without at least some opposition. Or we could say it like this. When we're committed to accomplishing great things for God, then we can expect resistance. We can expect pushback. All of which makes this quality of endurance so critical. Because without endurance, we'll be tempted to quit at the first indication of trouble. Even Nehemiah, in his efforts to build a wall around Jerusalem, had to endure through a couple of major obstacles. Let me show you what I mean. The first obstacle that Nehemiah dealt with is distractions from without. The construction on the wall had no sooner gotten underway before the workers became the target of verbal assaults. You see that initially back in chapter 2, verse 19. It's a section that we didn't spend a lot of time on when we were moving through that chapter, but it tells us there that when Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite official, and Geshem the Arab heard about it, they mocked and ridiculed us. "What is this you are doing?" they asked. "Are you rebelling against the king?" And now the same kind of attacks are also evident in the first part of chapter 1. Look at the first couple of verses there. When Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, he became angry and was greatly incensed. He ridiculed the Jews, and in the presence of associates in the army of Samaria, he said, "What are those feeble Jews doing? Will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish in a day? Can they bring the stones back to life from those heaps of rubble, burned as they are?" So get the picture here, gang. Sanballat, the governor of Samaria, along with his comrades, Tobiah and Geshem, actually some ancient manuscripts call them Larry, Moe, and Curly. These three guys begin to ridicule the Jews and accuse them of rebelling against King Artaxerxes. And through a series of rapid-fire derisive questions, they insinuate that the Jews were too weak and too incompetent to complete the wall. Maybe you're wondering, well, what caused this unprovoked violent outburst? We can't say for sure, but more than likely Sanballat and the other Samaritan official realized that a powerful Jerusalem would mean a depressed Samaria. With Jerusalem once more a well-protected city, its very location would attract trade and rob Samaria of its economic supremacy. Not surprisingly then, these sidewalk supervisors sustain their sarcasm in verse 3. Tobiah the Ammonite, who was at his side, said, "What are they building? If even a fox climbed up on it, he would break down their walls of stone." Uh-oh. Did you notice? Tobiah just made a crucial mistake, didn't he? He designates the project as their wall. Isn't that typical of critics? They constantly look at situations from a human viewpoint. They call it their project, their plans, their mission. But what they fail to consider is that they may, in fact, be criticizing the Lord's work and the Lord's plans. Yes, Nehemiah was the foreman on this project, but God was the designer. He was the master architect behind this building project. So how did Nehemiah respond? What was his initial reaction here? Did he quit? Did he throw in the towel? Did he say, "I'm on the next bus back to Babylon"? No, on the contrary, you can see it for yourself. We'll pick it up at verses 4 and 5. What does he say? "Hear us, O God, for we are despised. Turn their insults back on their own heads. Give them over as plunder in a land of captivity. Do not cover up their guilt or blot out their sins from your sight, for they have thrown insults in the face of the builders." By now it should come as no surprise that Nehemiah here begins to pray. And I hope you're picking up on the fact that prayer was a distinct and consistent part of our hero's approach to problem solving. He fought his battles on his knees. When faced with this kind of demoralizing attack, he immediately calls upon God for help. And then, after praying, Nehemiah and company resume their construction. Some of us like to pray and then sit around on our hands waiting for God to do something. But not Nehemiah. Clearly here he blended the divine perspective with human responsibility. He faced Sanballat's opposition with both prayer and hard work. And thus in verses 7 and 8, as the work now begins to make rapid progress, these enemies decide to increase the heat. We'll call it the big squeeze. You can see it there, joining Sanballat and the Samaritans from the north, Tobiah and the Ammonites from the east, Geshem and the Arabs from the south, were men from Ashdod, a Philistine city, from the west. In other words, here's tiny, defenseless Jerusalem, surrounded on every side by those who are bent on her destruction. And how does her citizens respond? Well, make sure you don't miss it. Look at it in verse 9. But we prayed to our God, and we posted a guard day and night to meet this threat. Is that great or what? Collectively now, the people together turn to God for help. You think maybe, is it just possible that Nehemiah's influence is rubbing off on them a little bit? Here's the point, gang. The temptation to quit is always the greatest when we're facing resistance, isn't it? The temptation to quit is always the greatest when we're facing resistance. And we need to learn from Nehemiah. Our main man endured. He persevered as a result of God's purposes. He persevered, and as a result, God's purposes moved forward. Nehemiah's instructions at this point were very simple. Keep mixing that mortar and hand me another brick. I believe there's a lesson there for us today. This passage confirms the fact that even when our work is in keeping with God's will, we can expect to face resistance. Even when our mission is in keeping with God's will, we can expect to face negativity and criticism and opposition. I mean, certainly Nehemiah here is in the center of God's will, right? We wouldn't question that. Nehemiah is exactly where the Lord wanted him to be, and yet he still is suffering all kinds of harassment, isn't he? When we're attempting to do great things for God, there's going to be obstacles along the way. You can count on it. And I don't know if you've ever realized this or not. I don't know if you've ever really picked up on this. I'm guessing you have, but it's a whole lot easier to tear people down than it is to build them up. You ever notice that? Because human nature is what it is, sinful human beings, it's a whole lot easier to tear people down than to build them up. Easier to find fault and criticize and nitpick and say it can't be done. And you would think it'd be different among God's people, right? You would think that things would be different among those who know better. But what I've discovered in my years of ministry is that you're always going to have the Sanballats, the Tobiahs, and the Geshems who feel like they're doing some noteworthy service by tearing others down and demoralizing the troops. Those people are always going to be there. Apparently, they just choose to ignore that biblical mandate. We have a responsibility. We have a duty as believers in Christ to encourage one another, to support one another, to say positive things. One of my favorite quotes on encouragement, you may have heard it before, but timely words, and I think they fit well here today, actually come from the Scottish preacher William Barclay. Barclay put it like this. He said, one of the highest of human duties is the duty of encouragement. It's easy to laugh at men's ideals. It's easy to pour cold water on their enthusiasm. It's easy to discourage others. The world is full of discouragers. We have a Christian duty to encourage one another. And many a time a word of praise or thanks or appreciation or cheer has kept a man on his feet. Blessed is the person who speaks such a word. When faced with resistance, our modus operandi needs to be that of Nehemiah. Just keep on praying and hand me another brick. Obstacle number 1. Distractions from without. Obstacle number 2. discouragement from within. I'm of the persuasion that Nehemiah's greatest challenge may well have occurred in verse 10. Look at it with me. He says, "Meanwhile, the people in Judah said, the strength of the laborers is giving out, and there is so much rubble that we cannot rebuild the wall." You see what's happening, don't you? The team was physically and psychologically whipped. And so they approach Nehemiah and they say, "Guess what? We can't finish. We're done. Find yourself some other bricklayers." And what was the cause of their discouragement here? Well, let's take a closer look. Look at verse 6. It says, "So we rebuilt the wall till all of it reached half its height, for the people worked with all their hearts." Uh-oh. You know you're in trouble when you reach the halfway point, don't you? It's what you call the mid-wall crisis. You ever heard of that before? There it is, the mid-wall crisis. And what are the symptoms? The freshness is gone. That appealing newness that had initially motivated them begins to wear off. And not only that, but additionally, the energy level begins to fade. Notice, the strength of the laborers is giving out. That verb for giving out that I highlighted on the screen, it means to stumble, totter, or stagger. So the picture here is that of a badly beaten boxer in the final rounds of his fight. Think Rocky Balboa, right? His knees are like jelly. He can't maintain his balance. He's reeling more and more with every blow. It's the same word picture here. The troops have been working diligently, and now they're tired. They're staggering. Their strength is failing. And any second now, they're ready to go down for the final count. But what's interesting about verse 10 is that it also identifies the reason for their exhaustion. So make sure you don't miss it here. Look at what they said. They said, "There is so much rubble. There is so much rubble that we can't rebuild the wall." What's the problem? Their vision is misdirected, isn't it? They said, "Nehemiah, we look around us and all we see is debris and dirt and rocks and garbage, and there is so much rubble. Nehemiah, we can't do it. We can't go on." When you stop and think about it, that's a fascinating statement, isn't it? You say, "Gary, what makes it so fascinating?" Well, analyze it for a second. In reality, there's no more rubble here in chapter 4 than there was back in chapter 2, right? It's not like Jerusalem was a rubble dumping ground for Arab garbage trucks. In other words, no extra rubble has arrived since they initially started the project. Well, then what's the difference? Well, what's changed between chapter 2 and chapter 4? Their perspective. The focus of their attention. They lost sight of the goal, and their vision was misdirected. Go back with me for just a second. You can flip back a page or so in your Bibles if you'd like. Remember chapter 2, verses 17 and 18? Remember what Nehemiah said there? He said, "You see the trouble we're in? Jerusalem lies in ruins and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let's rebuild this wall of Jerusalem. We'll no longer be in disgrace." And I also told them about the gracious hand of my God upon me and what the king has said to me. Remember it was that pep rally where Nehemiah rallied the troops and said, "We can do this, we can make this happen." He got them focused, and how did the people respond? Into verse 19, they replied, "Let's do this. Let's make it happen. Let's start rebuilding." In other words, we can do it. But then somewhere around halfway up the wall, the people took their eyes off of God and they started gawking at the garbage. I wonder, has that ever happened to you? Ever lost your perspective? Maybe God called you to a specific task and you started out gangbusters. Things were clicking, right? There was excitement, there was energy, the work was invigorating. And then somewhere along the way, maybe when the work was about halfway done, you just kind of lost your bearings. Maybe it was due to a hectic schedule. The hours were long, the thank yous were few. Perhaps it was connected to some harsh criticism. Some yahoo took a pot shot at you. It wasn't what you needed to hear. And you thought, I don't need to be doing this. I can find somewhere else to invest my time. Get somebody else to deal with this hassle. Or maybe it was just a matter of being physically depleted. Perhaps your strength was sapped because you were trying to do too much. I guess what I'm asking you today is, have you been there? Have you done that? Have you ever gotten discouraged from gazing at the garbage? Ever found yourself like the people just kind of muttering, rubble? This is nothing but rubble. I don't want to have to deal with all this crummy rubble. You know, the truth is it can happen to any one of us. What's the solution to those difficulties? What's the remedy to distractions from without and discouragement from within? Well, Nehemiah doesn't leave us in the dark, does he? Look at it. Verse 14. He said, after I looked things over, I stood up and I said to the nobles, the officials, the rest of the people, don't be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, your sons and your daughters, your wives, and your homes. I don't know if that sounds vaguely familiar to you today, but if you've been with us all along in this study, it really should. Where have we encountered that phrase that's highlighted? The great and awesome God. Where have we seen that? The answer is back in chapter 1, verse 5. Remember Nehemiah's initial prayer? He said, then I said, O Lord, God of heaven, the great and awesome God. You see, again, Nehemiah didn't wait until he was on the front lines to settle that issue. He decided that way back in his prayer closet in Susa. And so right from the start, right from the very outset, Nehemiah latches on to the Lord, the great and awesome God, so that later on, when everything starts unraveling and everybody wants to quit, and when everybody is saying it can't be done, there's so much trouble, Nehemiah could move in to lift their focus off the debris and put them back on the sovereign God who had the power to do something about it. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, yeah, Gary, but does it work? It sounds great, but does it really work? Well, I'll let you be the judge. Remember, verse 10, the strength of the labor is giving out. There's so much rubble, we can't rebuild the wall. Nehemiah moves in, lifts their focus. Now look at verse 16 and following. From that day on, half of my men did the work, while the other half were equipped with spears, shields, bows, and armor. The officers posted themselves behind all the people of Judah who were rebuilding the wall. Those who carried materials did their work with one hand and held a weapon in the other. And each of the builders wore his sword at his side as he worked. But the man who sounded the trumpet stayed with me. And then I said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, the work is extensive and spread out. We're widely separated from each other along the wall. Whenever you hear the sound of the trumpet, join us there. Our God will fight for us. So we continued the work with half the men holding spears from the first light of dawn until the stars came out. Wow. Are you kidding me? These are the same people who just a short time ago were too exhausted to continue. They're ready to cash in their chips. And now all of a sudden, they've got energy to burn. They're working around the clock and they're feeling great. Why? The only possible explanation is that they got their focus back where it needed to be. They took their eyes off of the problems and they began to focus on the one who had it all under control. And you're probably wondering, okay, Gary, I can see where that worked in that specific situation. I can see how it worked in Nehemiah's day. But will it work today? Will it work in 2022? Will the same principle hold true in our situation? I believe it will. I believe it will based on what the Apostle Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians chapter 4. Over in the New Testament, the Apostle wrote this. He said, we're pressed on every side by troubles, but we're not crushed. We're perplexed, but not driven to despair. We're hunted down, but never abandoned by God. We get knocked down, but we are not destroyed. Can you say resistance? I mean, there it is, right? But look how Paul continues. Same text, same passage, next verse. For our present troubles are small, and they won't last very long. And yet they produce for us a glory that vastly outweighs them and will last forever. So we don't look at the troubles that we can see now. We don't look at the troubles that we can see now. Rather, we fix our gaze on things that cannot be seen. For the things we see now will soon be gone. The things we cannot see, those are the things that will last forever. Is that great or what? I mean, what an incredible reminder. Paul here, echoing Nehemiah, says, change your perspective. And notice in particular that line, our present troubles are small and they won't last very long. He's not promising there won't be troubles. He's not promising that there won't be difficulties. The trials are real. The opposition will absolutely come, but in comparison to eternity, they won't last long. And not only that, but God can use those hardships to develop us, to shape us. How did we say it at the very outset of the message? We said, adversity and resistance are necessary for building strong disciples. Can we just be honest enough this morning to acknowledge that often we don't recognize what's best for us? Our natural tendency is to shield ourselves from windy situations. We want God to remove the challenges and difficulties from our lives when instead, God knows that we need them. Ultimately, His goal isn't to simply fix us. His goal is to grow us, to make us strong, mature. Life in a storm-free bubble might seem to be a wonderful thing, but in reality, it can be detrimental to our development. Enduring through resistance is the way spiritual strength is built. Deep roots are sent down, and fruit is born in our lives. That way, when the storms do come, even the most severe of storms, as they inevitably will have the capacity to stay strong, to resist, to endure. It's true, the persecution that Nehemiah was facing is radically different from anything that we're experiencing today. But quite frankly, we can also see how that could change very quickly, can't we? Beyond that, we know that the warfare that we're facing is real. Paul said in Ephesians 6, our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, the authorities, the powers of this dark world, and the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Bottom line this morning, gang, bottom line, our spiritual adversary is going to do everything he can to resist us. We have an enemy that wants to hinder what we're trying to accomplish here. We have an adversary who wants to slow down the progress of Christ's kingdom in Wells County. Satan wants us to be discouraged. He would love to see us get frustrated and just give up. Nothing of lasting significance transpires without at least some opposition. Nothing of lasting significance transpires without at least some resistance. When we're committed to accomplishing great things for God, we can expect to encounter challenges. Opposition will be coming. Resistance, we're going to encounter resistance. What's our response today? We're going to quit? We're going to get discouraged? Going to run scared? Or will we follow Nehemiah's example? Will we go into battle on our knees? Will we remember our great and awesome God and claim his promises? Can we allow Nehemiah's confidence in God to become our confidence as we fix our eyes on Jesus today and exclaim together, our God will fight for us. We have a God who will fight for us if we're depending on him and seeking his help. In fact, that's how we're going to end the service today, by declaring together that we're going to go to battle in our knees. We're going to focus on our God for his help and deliverance. How about we stand as Gerald comes to lead us?